Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Council of Graduate Schools webinar, 10 Things Graduate Deans Need to Know in the New Congress. Your presenters for today will be Lauren Inouye, Vice President for Public Policy and Government Affairs here at the Council of Graduate Schools, and Kenneth Polishchuk, Senior Manager for Public Policy and Government Affairs at the Council of Graduate Schools. Before we get started with their presentation, I'd just like to go through a few logistical and technical points. First off, the plan for today is that there will be one presentation of approximately 40 minutes, followed by a 20-minute question and answer session. The webinar recording and slides will be emailed to participants as well as posted on the CGS website. During the Q&A session, you can submit questions through the GoToWebinar control panel on the right of your screen, as shown in the picture above. If you're having any sorts of technical issues or problems, troubleshooting help is available through GoToWebinar at the link below. The most common problem that we have is with audio. So if you're having trouble hearing us, try switching to a different audio connection. You can change from the telephone to your mic and speakers or vice versa without having to leave the webinar session. If you experience trouble with a telephone connection, you can click problem dialing in the GoToWebinar control panel for an alternate phone number to dial. So with no more delay, I'd like to introduce Lauren and Kenneth.
Great, thank you, Matt. So this is Lauren and Kenneth with CGS, and we just want to thank you, first of all, for joining us during this afternoon. Kenneth and I are excited because, as you know, we had a new Congress sworn in on Thursday, January 3rd, and you can see up on the slide there, we did make the rounds up on Capitol Hill to represent CGS and meet particularly some of the new freshman members of Congress who might not be as familiar with graduate education. As you are probably also aware, the changes in leadership in the House in particular, given that is now under Democratic majority, really sets a different tone for this new 116th Congress, particularly when it comes to leadership in committees of jurisdiction. A lot of the work that we do here at CGS as it relates to higher education, tax, immigration, science and research policy all falls under different committees that have jurisdiction over those particular issues. So for us as staff, it's really important that we know who those players are. And as for CGS members, especially if you have a new member of Congress representing your district or your state, to know what kind of committees of jurisdiction they end up on. Now that the dust has settled, over the next couple of months or so, in the past couple of weeks, leadership has been announcing new positions on some of those committees. In the Senate, because the Republicans have remained in control of that chamber, we don't have too much shakeup in terms of Republican and Democratic participation on the committees. But in the House, it's been a very case-by-case basis on the announcement of the different makeup of those committees and their respective subcommittees. So we will continue to reach out over the next month or two to some of those members that are new to their roles on the committees, and to help, inform them about CGS's priorities as it relates to those issue areas that I mentioned earlier.
Hi, everyone. This is Kenneth. So there are many new members of Congress. Many of them are new to government. They have, the first time, this is their first job in any kind of elected capacity. There are about a quarter of the House are freshmen, which is a pretty significant number. And about 10% of the Senate are freshmen, which is lower because less of the Senate is up for election every year. There's also a record number of women in this Congress, 131 to be exact. And the number of racial minorities also increased. And this is also the youngest Congress on record, with millennials increasing by over 400%. So that means that a lot of these members were very likely recently students. Maybe some of them have been recently graduate students. So that presents a little bit of a different dynamic, maybe a little bit of a different understanding from their perspective when we talk to them about issues dealing with higher education. So that presents some opportunities and also some challenges to think about as we and you all work with them in this new Congress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just add, when Kenneth and I were up on Capitol Hill and we had a chance to talk to some of their staff or their chiefs, they mentioned that their bosses were recent graduates or still had student loan debt that they were paying off. So I think programs like public service loan forgiveness and other loan repayment opportunities, they'll have an appetite to address, knowing how close that hits to home. So that's definitely good news for us, we hope. The second thing that CGS Dean should be aware of, and you can't really escape it from the news, is that the government shutdown has us off to a shaky start in the new year. We've really come at an impasse. Both chambers of Congress, the White House, and their respective political parties have really dug their heels in. And as of right now, the big contention point is that U.S. Mexico border wall funding. So you may be aware President Trump has requested over $5 billion to put up the wall. Prior to the holidays, the House Democrats did introduce a bill that would have given some level of funding, nowhere near the $5.6 billion that the White House was asking for, but it did not make any headway in the Senate or with the White House. The Senate has stated, particularly Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, that he's not going to entertain any bills, despite if they get passed through the House, that would provide a solution to the shutdown if President Trump said he would veto it. To the Senate Republicans, it's just not worth risking that political capital. So that being said, we really are kind of in a standstill. I think as it relates to graduate education, we know that some of the agencies, as it is only a partial shutdown, so the agencies that are not currently funded do have an impact on some of our federal research grants and programs. So not only are certain agencies not entertaining new requests for funding, but some of the agency staff have been prohibited from traveling, which unfortunately has caused some scientific communities to have to cancel their conferences if they had invited those speakers to come as plenary speakers. And it's also caused a lot, I think, of anxiety and uncertainty around what furloughed federal workers are or are not able to do in terms of pursuing some sort of side job to help pay their bills until there some sort of solution is resolved, whether that's back pay or just being able to simply return to work. There was a bill that was passed recently from both chambers to grant back pay to those furloughed employees. And last I saw, President Trump is expected to sign it today. And as you can imagine, given the difference in the political ideologies between the majority parties in the chamber, the House has been quick to introduce a series of bills to extend federal funding for those agencies whose funding has expired. One bill that would go through February 1st and a second that would run through the end of February. On the Senate side, there's been a bill introduced to prevent future shutdowns, but I don't think that either will gain much traction, knowing that they probably won't get signed into law unless they come to the table with that border wall funding. So much remains to be seen. We're heading on, what are we on, day 25, day 26? As of right now, it just started on December 22nd. And what we would ask, Kenneth and I, is if you are experiencing any difficulties because of what the shutdown has imposed on your research enterprise, we'd be interested to hear that. We're doing everything that we can to help communicate the harm that this is doing and sort of the delays in the research and scientific enterprise. CGS did put out a statement in our news network last week with President Suzanne Ortega calling for the shutdown to end. So we certainly are continuing to monitor this, but please do let us know if you are experiencing any of those difficulties, because it would help us to relay what's happening on the ground level. Okay. And then the third thing is clearly federal funding priorities differ between Congress and the White House. If we were running on a normal appropriations and budget cycle, what we could expect is President Trump to introduce his president's budget request. It typically comes out the first Monday in February. That's when it's expected. We've seen budgets introduced from our presidents, though, as late as May. Just depends on how quickly they're able to pull together their budget priorities on the recommendations of their executive cabinet. I think we will likely see a budget that is similar to the ones introduced from him in the past, which have made some pretty significant cuts and unprecedented cuts to programs of interest. Particularly, NIH received an 18% cut last year, and knowing how bipartisan that agency was, it was not really widely accepted by Congress or the NIH community. But the budget that truly matters, the one that carries the actual letter of the law, is the one that's passed by Congress. So even though the president's budget comes out establishing his or her priorities, at the end of the day, it's up to Congress to really enact into law those of 12 appropriations bills. Because the process has been dysfunctional, for lack of a better term, I think we will continue to see this done in a very piecemeal approach. Typically, bills that are easier to pass politically are marked up first in the committee, and those that are a little tougher pills to swallow are saved until later in the fiscal year. And sometimes coming up against really close that September 30th fiscal year end deadline. Other things we have to consider is that we are coming up on a debt ceiling, which expires in March. So, in addition to the actual pulling together of the budget, we do have a debt ceiling that is quickly approaching.
Right. So turning to Higher Education Act, it seems like we've been talking about a reauthorization for the past 4 or 5 years. So, here we go again. Congress wants to address this issue, but the main concern is that there are a few partisan sort of provisions in this bill that both parties remain pretty far apart on and haven't been able to come to any kind of consensus. With a divided Congress, it seems that will be even more difficult. However, there are some areas of common ground. For instance, the Senate did pass a FAFSA simplification bill last month before the 115th Congress adjourned. So there are areas that they can find some common ground on. The House did mark up and pass through committee their proposal to reauthorize the Higher Education Act last year. It was called the Prosper Act. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. Now that they're no longer in the majority, it's not going to be considered, and that's probably a good thing, mainly because the higher education community did have serious concerns with that bill. The Democrats, for their part, over the summer released the AIM Higher Act, which would be their proposal for an HEA reauthorization, and this one did have a lot of provisions in it that were very positive for graduate students. In particular, it didn't cap graduate student borrowing. It eliminated origination fees, which graduate students currently pay 2 of. It required more loan counseling, and it did not distinguish in terms of education level when it came to income-based repayment. And those are all issues that CGS has been pretty vocal about in the past. Another provision that it did include was something that CGS has advocated for over the last few years, and that was extending Pell Grants to graduate students. So that it would allow Pell Grants master's students to exhaust their Pell eligibility up to the semesters allowed in law, as long as they remain Pell eligible. And we're hearing that House Democrats plan to reintroduce AIM Higher this year. We're unclear when that'll be, and it's also unclear if and what of these provisions will remain in the reintroduced bill. However, it's really incumbent upon us now to continue to make the case for graduate students and graduate education, and to make sure that policymakers remain cognizant of these needs as they consider these policies. On the Senate side, it's a little bit less clear, mainly because the committee did not release a draft of a bill, although Senator Alexander did introduce some white papers last winter around accountability measures. That being said, now that he has announced that he's retiring from Congress in 2020, most people think that there will be an urgency for him to want to work on a bipartisan basis with Senator Murray, which they have done pretty successfully in the past, to pass a bill this year, because that has been a priority for him over the last few, actually over the entire time that he's been in Congress.
Mm-hmm. And Kenneth, if I could recall correctly, was it 2008 that HIA was last reauthorized?
That's correct.
Yeah, so we're now into year 11 of not having made sweeping changes to the law that oversees the majority of the delivery of higher ed in our nation. So while we've come close in certain years to getting something across the finish line, at least in the House, I think, as Kenneth mentioned, possibly with the announcement of Senator Alexander retiring, that may give the Senate Help Committee that additional push to actually pull together a bill that we just haven't seen in the past couple of years. Okay. And then, moving on, we wanted to address the issue of immigration and visa concerns. As you can see on the slide here, we have just a snapshot of the trend of first-time enrollment of international graduate students at U.S. institutions. And of course, this is data provided from our graduate enrollment degree reports. And so CGS has been fairly active in working with the broader higher education community on some of these proposed regulations that we've seen through the Department of Homeland Security, particularly as it comes to international students. One that we had addressed earlier in the fall was proposed increases to the Student and Exchange Visitor Program, which would impact not just international students looking to come and study here in the U.S., but also the institutions that host them. We did submit comments, and I believe we're waiting for the final regulations to come out to determine if those fees will stick and at what level. One that is a little bit farther out, but we've already been engaged with some of our colleagues on is potential changes to the term duration of status. So right now, we when it comes to international students, they are able to stay here in the U.S. so long as they are abiding by their program and they have their current visa. What the department is looking to do is to potentially change that into what they would call a maximum fixed stay. We have no further details at that point in terms of how long that fixed stay would be, but we have joined a working group to think about how to best message the concerns that we would have should this rule come to fruition. Another issue as it relates to our international student community's H-1B visas. Recently, DHS also proposed to change the way in which they draw from pools of H-1B, the H-1B lottery. So what they're aiming to do is to increase the number of individuals who are educated with a master's or a doctoral degree here in the U.S., with the intended goal of increasing the number available to the employment sector. DHS anticipated that by doing these changes to the way they draw from their respective caps, this would increase that number by about 16%. We did submit comments stating that we were supportive of increasing the number of individuals with master's and doctoral education in the U.S. workforce, but we also had some questions about potential unintended consequences for individuals who have less than a master's degree, and what would, if any, impact be on the ability to recruit and retain faculty and students to our colleges and universities. And last but not least, and this has really been, seems to be an evergreen issue at this point, is what to do about DACA. So this now, I think we're approaching a year and a half of those with DACA status kind of in limbo. They're not quite sure what's going to happen to their overall status. CGS does support a couple of pieces of legislation that would provide a permanent pathway to citizenship for these individuals. There was an opportunity last year for the House to pass a package of bills that would have addressed this, but it didn't go anywhere. So now what we're seeing is that it's been left up to the courts, the federal courts, to decide on a case-by-case basis of the legality and constitutionality of DACA. Thus far, they've upheld it, but we're getting to that point where it will likely tip over into the Supreme Court, at which time they'll have to make a final determination. So we're working with HACU, that's the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, as well as some of the other presidential organizations, to continue to urge that this is really a pipeline issue. So our undergrad DACA individuals of today are our graduate students of tomorrow.
Right. So tax and healthcare are unlikely to be as hot button as they were in the 115th Congress, but there are still some areas where both of those issues could get addressed. House Democrats are already talking about repealing parts of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, particularly as it has to do with the corporate tax rate, which could impact the deficit, and anything that impacts the deficit impacts spending, and spending, of course, impacts all programs, including programs that fund research and science and higher education. There's also already talks about restoring the state and local deduction, and that would impact particularly high-earning states in terms of the state budgets. And as I'm sure you all know, when state budgets are impacted, that also impacts higher education, particularly public institutions at the state level. It's unlikely that any of that is going to get enacted because the Senate will not touch anything that has to do with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and the president obviously won't sign it, but that's where some of the action will be, at least on the House side, particularly in terms of messaging. House Democrats also did introduce several bills at the end of last year that had to do with expanding tax credits for college students, and we're going to monitor to see if those bills get reintroduced in this Congress, and then we'll move forward from there. In terms of retirement savings accounts, we know that that's something that graduate students, particularly doctoral students, really care about. And the House, before it adjourned last December, one of the last actions that the Republican majority took was to pass another sort of smaller tax package, which included retirement savings accounts for graduate students. Now, although that was a Republican bill, that this does have bipartisan support in both chambers. So that's something that also we're going to make sure to keep an eye out on, and to work with policymakers as they try to create these kind of opportunities for graduate students. On the healthcare front, I think it was last month, a federal judge in Texas struck down the entirety of the ACA. That is, of course, going to be tied up in appeals, and it could end up again before the Supreme Court. There are some implications in terms of higher education, particularly with student health insurance plans and how that plays in with the employer mandate. And then also it would repeal the expansion of Medicaid, which again is on several fronts, would impact higher ed students. It could impact medical teaching hospitals and how they approach some of their patients. It could also impact students that depend on Medicaid. And of course, as I mentioned, with the SALT deduction, also state budgets, it would put more of a strain on state budgets, which could force them to make some decisions around higher education funding. So that's also something that we'll keep an eye on, even though that's not really in the legislative purview at the moment, since it really is tied up in the courts.
Great. So we've talked quite a bit about what's happening in Congress, but we can't ignore our executive branches either. The administration has been busily at work to try to repeal or overhaul some existing regulations, and to others making some sweeping changes. One that you may be aware of are changes to Title IX, particularly with respect to campus sexual assault. In November, the Department of Education released a notice of proposed rulemaking outlining the changes that they would make to the existing Title IX regulations. The open public comment period does end at the end of the month, so it is likely that your Title IX coordinator on your campus has been reviewing these changes, talking to their peers, and figuring out a sort of messaging statement. That being said, there's been a lot of discussion and a bit of confusion as well that's been created due to some of the unclarity around the regulations. I think that in discussions with our peers at other higher ed organizations, the consensus that we have come to, at least from the institutional standpoint, is that first of all, we know that each individual is going to have their own sort of personal perspectives on this issue, as it is a very sensitive one. But I think from the institutional perspective, one of the concerns is that it really increases the level of legal authority that campuses would be required to handle should a Title IX violation be found. So, for example, if a violation has been found to occur, both the accuser and the accused would be able to be cross-examined by their respective representation. So this is a new aspect. For campuses that are not as strongly resourced or maybe don't have in-house legal counsel, the question becomes, would they be required to sort of staff up? And for some, that may really put a budget restraint on them. So we're really looking at increasing staffing and capacity bottleneck. The other sort of question and concern I think that the community has is that the regulations in their entirety increase the level of the standard of evidence. So really requires that the evidence be clear and concise that a violation had occurred versus the current preponderance of evidence. So that I think has some implications for reporting. Students who feel that maybe it's not worth reporting their case because they don't believe that they'll, substantive action will be taken place because of it, may not report it. In terms of cross-examination, may be additionally stressful for both parties, and so could also see some sort of hesitancy to go ahead and report. So overall, I think that in terms of CGS, one of the questions that we have is what happens if a violation takes place off-campus property? Well, the department has said that, for example, if a violation occurs in off-campus housing, it would not be in violation with Title IX. But what happens on activities that are sort of endorsed by the university or have a strong affiliation, such as, study abroad, for example? So all of those questions are being vetted through, I think, the community, and we will continue to keep you apprised. Another major project or overhaul that the Department of Education is looking to do is putting together negotiated rulemaking. So negotiated rulemaking began on the 14th and will continue in a series of workshops and listening sessions and subcommittees. The three major issue areas that this negotiated rulemaking committee, which is again made up of members of the public, deals with accreditation, state authorization, and then some changes to teach grants. We know that another issue will be determination of credit hour, as well as the distance education, which is part of that state authorization.
Yes, the Department of Labor is also currently rewriting the 2016 overtime regulation, which doubled the salary threshold under which workers are guaranteed overtime pay. That was an issue that CGS commented on with our higher education community colleagues, particularly Coupa HR, which led the comments on that. When it was first promulgated, the initial concerns were with how it would impact graduate research assistants and postdocs in terms of the 40-hour mandate that it would impose. So once that regulation is released, it should be in March of this year, we're going to once again work with the community to see what, if any, impacts there are on graduate students, and we will be moving on from there in terms of ways to address it.
All right, awesome. Well, now that we've given you a pretty comprehensive overview of some of the major actions in both chambers of Congress, as well as the administration, we want to turn our efforts on to what can we do about it? Where does the advocacy piece come in? I love some of the data that comes out from an organization called the Congressional Management Foundation, or CMF. They conduct quite a bit of survey work in asking legislative staff up on Capitol Hill around what works best. What are those best practices to ensure that constituents are being heard and that their messages are being effective? So I just wanted to include this for you all to just show you that your voice really does matter. So as much as Kenneth and I are up here in DC advocating on behalf of graduate education, we can't do this alone. And so the voice of our membership and working with your government relations staff is crucial. As you can see here, the data show us that in-person visits with constituents ranks extremely high in terms of effectiveness in having your issue heard and being taken seriously. Contact from your constituents as well. So that could be email messages, letters, although I think sometimes those are a little antiquated, letters, phone calls. Social media is playing an increasing role as well, as we know. But making those overtures and getting to know your members of Congress and their staff, including at the district level, does have a meaningful influence. And so what does that look like depending on where you're physically located? Well, if you're here in Washington, D.C., and you have the opportunity to connect with, say, you have federal relations staff that are based here in D.C., they may be able to set up some congressional visits for you. And to build that relationship, share information, and really get on their radar. Advocacy is not a one and done scenario. So even if you are able to secure a couple meetings, make sure that once you're go back to your home district to follow up with the staff you met with, if it wasn't the actual member, thank them for their time, let them know that you appreciate being able to work with them, and find out a way to continue that conversation. And make sure to include your government relations staff. If you're located in your district, especially if you have a new member who's a freshman in the House or the Senate, send them a welcome letter, get to know them, help them navigate your world. So that could be inviting them to your campus, showing up to a town hall, meeting with their district staff at their district offices, inviting them to a 3MT event or something else where they'll have exposure to your faculty and to your students is a great way to really show the face behind, or rather, graduate education. And we say this kind of with the caveat that each of you has a specific campus protocol for how you operate in the advocacy space. Kenneth and I have gotten to know several of your campus federal relations staff, and they're wonderful. And, we do our best to try to loop them in whenever we're reaching out to certain members of Congress so that they're aware and not kind of taken by surprise. But they are, as you can imagine, also invaluable resources for your advocacy efforts.
So you actually have many more resources at your disposal than you might think already that are either publicly available or available on the CGS website. For instance, the congressional calendar, which is available on the CGS website, provides you with a calendar of when your member of Congress is in DC or in the district. So that's an important thing to know in case you want to schedule meetings, or you want to invite them to campus, or you want to attend a town hall, any of those kind of issues. All the members of Congress have their own websites, which have a variety of information, their bios, what their committee assignments are, what caucuses they're on, what their areas of interest are. So those are all things that you could get to know before you meet with them, or just to kind of know what kind of things they're going to be looking at as they progress in their policy-making career. The Congressional Research Service, which is a federal government entity, releases a membership profile for every Congress, which probably will come out, I'm going to say, in March, because it takes them a while to kind of really get that together. And that has a wealth of information on each member. So that's also something that could be very useful. And once that is released, we'll also link that to our website. And then the committee websites as well. You can, as Lauren mentioned earlier, the committees are being formulated right now, so the websites are still being updated. But you should go on and take a look and see which of these committees your members serve on. When are there some hearings that are of importance to graduate education that you may want to just listen to stay apprised of these issues? What bills they're working on, and what other issues are in their purview at the moment. And then finally, the CGS resources. We have a weekly newsletter called Washington Insights and Highlights. And that goes out every week that Congress, whether the Senate or the House, is in session. And it provides a pretty, in-depth overview of what Congress and the administration are currently working on as it pertains to graduate education. And that is a member resource. So if you do not receive it, please email me and I will add you to our list. We also have policy and issue briefs and other kinds of resources, such as like template letters and hints on how to write an op-ed, which we've heard several times from staff of members of Congress that their bosses read op-eds from their local papers. Because especially when they're in DC, they feel disconnected from their district. They want to know what's happening back home. They read the local paper almost on a daily basis. So that, in some respects, even not necessarily more so, but to supplement, let's say, social media, is a good avenue to reach them, because they read that paper. If there's an op-ed there from a graduate dean or even a graduate student that you're able to get into that paper, that could really sort of land on their radar rather quickly.
And I would add on to that, Kenneth, and say that if you're not writing an op-ed or contributing some sort of communication as an individual constituent, one thing you may want to consider is working with your communication staff of your school or your university to make sure that your message is kind of on point and you have that seal of approval. Okay. So last but not least, and perhaps most importantly, graduate deans are effective advocates, and we can't emphasize that enough. And we wanted to highlight a couple of different opportunities for you to be involved in CGS advocacy as a member. The first is our advisory committee on advocacy and public policy, and I'm actually going to skip ahead to this next slide. These are the 10 member deans who sit on the ACAP, as we call it. And it is a CGS committee that helps set the tone and the direction of our advocacy efforts. We have quarterly conference calls, and we meet twice a year in person at the summer workshop and the annual meeting. And these are the individuals who really help shape the voice of CGS's membership when it comes to responding to different pieces of legislation or regulations. Right now, we're working on a federal policy agenda, for example. So we've vetted some of that content to them for feedback. But this is a great way, if you want to get involved in the future, to think about how you can help promote graduate education in the federal arena.
Yeah, we also have a group of deans called Advocacy Ambassadors. This is completely a self-selected group, which we started summer 2017. A lot of them are new deans, but it's not exclusive to new deans. We share monthly updates with this group, policy updates, and they are just kind of a way that we can spread and amplify the message for graduate education, and they also use us as a resource to really get at some of these issues that we've been discussing in this webinar. So again, completely self-selected. If you have an interest to join, it doesn't really require much of you. Just send me an email and I will add you to our list. You will receive monthly updates. We also do some webinars that are just for that group from time to time. So that's something that you can also be a part of. So if that's something that you're interested in, please shoot me an email and I'll be happy to add you to our mailing list for that.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, if you're not quite ready to take the deep dive and consider being considered for the ACAP committee, this is a nice way to get your feet wet and check out what CGS advocacy is about. If you do in the future want to consider serving on the ACAP committee. Last but not least, I would say is in order to help us streamline communications and make sure that your government relations staff are tuned in to our work and vice versa, a new network has been created called the Graduate Government Relations Network, or GGRN. To date, we have about 100 individuals. So this network is comprised of the government relations staff of CGS member institutions. And so right now what we do is we give them monthly email updates, and we've been trying to meet many of them in person for the ones that are located here in DC. But it's a great way to make sure that anytime Kenneth or I reach out and send a letter on behalf of CGS, or we catch wind that we might see a potential regulation drop impacting grad ed, that we can get to the folks quickly who are going to be tuned in on what's going on the Hill. So this is completely optional, but if you are interested in having your having your government relations staff added to the GGRN, please go ahead and contact me. I'd be happy to add them. At this moment in time, we also send out those communications that the GGRN receives to the graduate dean as well that recommended them. That is opt out, but we don't want to deprive you of that information as well. So I'll just give you an example of how this has been helpful. A couple months ago, there was a Senate Dear Colleague circulating that dealt with an issue. And we wanted to make sure that it was addressed quickly because the window of opportunity to get additional senators to sign onto this letter was less than 48 hours. So you can imagine how helpful it was to be able to just email out the GGRN to say, we just want you to be aware this letter is circulating. If this is of interest to your campus as it relates to graduate education, we urge you to reach out to your senator. And we actually had quite a few of your government relations staff respond and secure some additional signatures. So that's just, kind of a snapshot, I guess, if you will, of how this community has the power to move the needle forward sometimes when we have those really short windows of opportunity to make real change. So that being said, again, we just want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. If there are any questions, please don't hesitate to submit those, and Kenneth and I will be here to answer any questions. And of course, you can type them into the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. And if you don't feel comfortable or think of something later, please reach out to Kenneth or I. We'd be happy to talk to you and understand what's happening at your university. Okay, so one question. So one question that we had pop up here, let's see, is what is the best way to relay CGS's HIA priorities? Okay, so HIA, again, stands, just for everybody's clarification, HIA stands for Higher Education Act. So when Kenneth was reviewing the HIA reauthorization discussion, essentially CGS has priorities that we've outlined in terms of what we believe is the best solution for graduate education, with things like student financial aid, loan repayment programs. We do have a set of policy briefs that outline some of our priorities, and we have one. If you visit CGS's website and go to the Public Policy and Advocacy tab, on the left-hand side, you'll see an issues bar. You can click on that, and we have some policy briefs that outline. So if you want to print those out or share them with your government relations staff, your faculty, share them with your legislators, it very clearly kind of outlines some of our policy priorities, as well as some additional background information like who are graduate students, what are some of the financial challenges that they face. So please feel free to utilize those in your efforts.
Yeah, we have a question here. So that says, our institution has a GAN grant. We understand that since Department of Education is open and funded, there will be no delay on the drawdown for this grant. Is that your understanding? Yes, that's correct. The Department of Education is not shut down, so all of its activities are up and running as normal. Well, the question here is, can you say anything more about the TEACH grants and how the negotiated rulemaking could impact them? Mm-hmm. So the TEACH grant, the issue there is that some of the TEACH grants were converted to loans. And I think that this is the issue that they want to address in the negotiated rulemaking so that going forward, that does not happen again. So I think that is going to be what the NEGREG really focuses on in terms of the TEACH grants.
Yeah, so our understanding is that for individuals who received TEACH grants that did not find employment opportunities as prescribed by what the grant required, their grants were essentially converted into loans. So, it's painful for those individuals that received the grants because now they're having to pay back interest on a loan that they technically never took out. It wasn't a loan. So in order to bypass this, the negotiated rulemaking committee is going to reconsider how that's administered.
And the department is taking steps to rectify the issue on the back end to people that's already happened with. So that's also something else that we're looking out for to make sure that goes forward.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, everyone, I think that's going to be it for today. Thank you to Lauren and Kenneth for their discussion. The webinar recording and slides will be emailed to participants in this webinar as well as posted on the CGS website within 1 week of the webinar. Please feel free to share these with interested colleagues. The next CGS webinar, it's going to be a sponsored webinar. It's titled A Graduate School's Phased Approach to CRM Starts with Admissions, and it will be on January 29th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be sponsored by Salesforce.org. Thank you so much for participating, and have a great day.